The Chiron on MSNBC read, "Live, Jasmine Crockett joins Chris Hayes." The air felt electric. Chris leaned forward with a practiced calm. "Congresswoman Crockett, thank you for joining us." Jasmine adjusted her mic, eyes steady. "Thank you, Chris. Let's get to the truth." The camera cut to a tight shot. Crockett wasn't here to hedge. She wasn't here to speculate. She was here to name names and dismantle the silence. "Let's stop pretending this is about due process," she began. "If it were, those Epstein files would have been released the day they hit the courts." But the GOP? Suddenly silent. Crickets. Nothing to say. Chris blinked. The studio, so used to political nuance and soft deflection, leaned in. "They yelled for those documents for years, until they realized whose names might be in them," she said, voice rising. "Until their donors, their friends, their former presidents, maybe even themselves, showed up in black and white." Chris nodded slowly. "You're referring to the party's change in tone this week." "Oh, I'm not just referring to tone. I'm talking about strategy. Obstruction. Deflection," Jasmine snapped. "This isn't oversight anymore, this is a cover-up." Social media exploded. Tweets poured in. TikTok clips were already being clipped and captioned. And Jasmine didn't pause. "You want to talk about law and order? Start with why a man found liable for sexual abuse is still being defended by half the people in this chamber. Start there." Chris sat back, stunned. Not a single card left unplayed. Not a single fact softened for comfort. While they gut healthcare, while they slash food access for kids, while they sell out working families for donor checks, they're hoping no one looks too closely at Mar-a-Lago. A beat passed. "Well," she said, folding her hands calmly. "I'm looking. And I'm not blinking." The screen split between Jasmine's steady gaze and Chris Hayes trying to absorb the force that had just rocked his studio. Chris Hayes wasn't the only one stunned. Within minutes, the interview flooded timelines. Instagram Reels, X Threads, YouTube Shorts, every corner of the internet had Jasmine Crockett's voice front and center. In the control room, producers whispered, eyes darting to one another. "Is she actually going to name names?" one asked. "She's not holding back," another muttered. Back on set, Chris cleared his throat, attempting to steer. "Congresswoman, I want to be clear here. Are you implying that some of your Republican colleagues are intentionally suppressing the Epstein files?" Jasmine's eyes narrowed. "Chris, I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts." Her tone sharpened like a blade. "They demanded these files. They said, 'Let the truth come out.' But when the truth came wrapped in familiar names, when it reached the edge of their own circles, they slammed the brakes." Chris leaned forward again. "Names like..." Jasmine didn't flinch. "Let's start with the ones we already know. The ones photographed. The ones who took rides. The ones who made excuses. If you think they weren't protected, look at the silence now. Look at Pam Bondi." The audience went still. The mention of Bondi, Trump's loyalist, former Attorney General of Florida, hit hard. "You think her TV appearances are coincidence?" Jasmine continued. "She's not defending the people, she's defending a man who was found liable in a court of law. A man with a pattern. A man with power, and now, with protection." Chris didn't interrupt. He couldn't. "Epstein didn't operate alone," Jasmine said, voice steady but lethal. "He thrived in rooms full of men who knew, who laughed, who signed the checks and looked the other way." She turned to the camera now. "If this makes you uncomfortable, good. Because a whole generation of young girls never got the chance to speak. The very least we can do is stop pretending the silence is innocent." Backstage, campaign aides were already scrambling. Press teams were in damage control mode. But Crockett didn't need a comms team, her truth was the only script she needed. And this wasn't over. The screen split into side-by-side footage, one half showing old clips of Trump laughing alongside Jeffrey Epstein at Mar-a-Lago, the other half a live feed from MSNBC. Jasmine Crockett sat across from Chris Hayes, leaning forward, fire in her voice. Let's talk about facts, Chris, she said, her tone razor-sharp. Trump was found liable for sexual abuse. That's not speculation. That's not politics. That's the law. Chris nodded solemnly. And now, the GOP, who screamed for full transparency, has gone silent on Epstein's files. Jasmine didn't blink. Because they were never after the truth. They were after a weapon. But when that weapon pointed back at them, suddenly it was classified, complex, or worse, forgotten. She turned to the camera. Pam Bondi wants to spin this? She can try. But we see you. You protected a man who partied with predators and bankrolled your politics. That's not justice. That's complicity. The studio fell still. Chris Hayes adjusted his glasses but didn't interrupt. Jasmine was just getting started. They'll tell you we're being partisan for calling this out. But ignoring abuse to protect your donors? That's not bipartisanship, it's betrayal. Gasps echoed through social media as the clip went viral within minutes. Twitter exploded. TikTok flooded with reactions. Jasmine had just turned the conversation from whispers to war cries. And the GOP? Still silent. Chris Hayes leaned back in his chair, visibly shaken, not from disagreement, but from the weight of what had just been said. Jasmine Crockett didn't wait for a follow-up. They cut healthcare for mothers. They gutted school lunch programs. They turned their backs on working people, she continued. All while shielding a man who trafficked influence through silence and parties at Mar-a-Lago. Chris finally found his voice. Congresswoman, I want to be careful here. Chris, Jasmine interrupted, gently but firmly, I've been careful. For years. But careful hasn't protected our daughters. Careful hasn't saved survivors. And careful sure didn't stop Epstein from shaking hands with presidents and buying his way into power. The audience in the control room was dead quiet. One tech whispered, she's torching the whole house. Jasmine adjusted her mic, staring directly into the camera again. Every time they shout about protecting the children, ask them where that energy was when Epstein was alive. Ask them why they're protecting the names tied to those flight logs instead of protecting victims. A pause. Just enough to let the words breathe. And to the Republican Party, if you didn't know, you're incompetent. If you did, you're complicit. Either way, this blood is on your hands. The final sentence hit like a gavel. Headlines were already forming. Jasmine Crockett nukes GOP on live TV. Crockett names what the GOP won't. Pam Bondi's team issued a statement within the hour, defensive, vague, tone-deaf. But it was too late. The silence had shattered. The studio lights dimmed just slightly as Chris Hayes took a long pause, clearly understanding the gravity of the moment. Congresswoman, he said softly, I don't think we've seen this level of clarity and, frankly, fire, in a very long time. Jasmine didn't smile. Her tone was calm, but each word landed like a brick. They want us distracted, she said. That's the play. Talk about gas prices. Talk about immigration. Talk about anything, except a man who's already been found liable for sexual abuse and the political machine protecting him. Chris hesitated. You mean the GOP? I mean the machine, she corrected, eyes narrowing. The same one that moved money from working families to billionaires. The same one that looked the other way while Epstein trafficked girls to men in suits. And yes, many of them wear red ties. She reached down, pulled out a worn document, and held it up. This is the 2020 GOP memo demanding a full release of the Epstein files. Their words. Not mine. And now? Not a peep. Because they know what's in them. And they know we know. Social media lit up again, #SheKnows trended instantly. On TikTok, a clip of Jasmine raising the memo had already been stitched into a dozen political commentary videos. It wasn't just a moment, it was a movement. Chris Hayes nodded solemnly. And the hypocrisy? Jasmine leaned forward one last time. They never wanted justice. They wanted a shield. And I just broke it. Boom. That was the sound the internet made when truth wasn't whispered, but roared. By the time they cut to commercial, producers were sprinting down hallways, phones pressed to ears, scrambling to handle what had just unfolded. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a guest, she had become the headline. Backstage, Chris Hayes sat stunned, flipping through his notes, realizing half the questions he'd prepared were now irrelevant. Jasmine hadn't followed the narrative. She'd rewritten it. And she wasn't done. When they returned from break, Jasmine leaned in again, no cue cards, no hesitation. "Let me ask America a question," she said, addressing the camera directly. If Hunter Biden's laptop was justification for hearings, why isn't Epstein's flight log? The question wasn't rhetorical. It landed like a thunderclap. Even Chris raised his eyebrows. Jasmine continued, voice steady but cutting. They said they wanted transparency. They demanded accountability. But only when it served their agenda. When it's about them, their donors, their friends, their secrets. Suddenly it's under investigation or let's move on. Chris tried to cut in gently. Some would say this is just political theater. She shook her head. No, Chris. This is the unveiling of the rot. And I'm not interested in playing dead so they can keep pretending the lights are off. Viewers across the country were no longer just watching, they were glued. Posts flooded X and Instagram. She just ended the GOP's Epstein defense. Jasmine Crockett is doing what journalists won't. Where's the White House on this? Pam Bondi was already trending again, for all the wrong reasons. Cropped screenshots of her old Epstein defensive interviews circled online like vultures. And Jasmine? She sat back in her chair, unbothered. Because she didn't come to play nice. She came to finish what so many were too afraid to even start. The moment Jasmine shifted from calling out the GOP to naming names, the studio air changed. She leaned forward, not with aggression, but with surgical intent. Congressman Jordan. Senator Blackburn. Governor DeSantis. All of you demanded transparency when it was politically convenient, she said, her voice unwavering. But when those files landed on your desk, you didn't blink, you buried them. Chris Hayes froze mid-nod. Even he hadn't expected her to go there. Behind her, the screen lit up with public quotes from GOP leaders who once clamored for the Epstein list to be unsealed. Now, juxtaposed with their recent silence, the hypocrisy blared louder than any headline. Then Jasmine dropped what felt like a live grenade into the conversation. One of these names didn't just read the file, he called to suppress it. You want to talk obstruction? There was a flicker, Chris, startled. The studio team scrambled. A name had been redacted on screen. But Jasmine had seen it. They keep asking if I've got proof, she said, smiling. I don't throw darts in the dark, I aim with receipts. The control room went silent. America leaned closer. Because for the first time, the cover-up wasn't just a rumor, it had a pulse, and Jasmine Crockett was holding the stethoscope. Chris Hayes leaned forward, eyes narrowed. Congresswoman, some say the GOP is just being cautious, waiting for due process. What do you say to that? Jasmine didn't hesitate. Due process, she echoed, her voice steady but razor-sharp. Jeffrey Epstein is dead. Donald Trump was already found liable for sexual abuse in a court of law. What exactly are they waiting for now? She turned slightly, locking eyes with the camera. They want to pretend they're protecting the justice system. But what they're really protecting is their proximity to power. To wealth. To him. Hayes blinked, visibly taken aback. So you're saying? I'm saying, she cut in, that if there were no GOP fingerprints on this mess, those Epstein files would have been published the minute they were unsealed. But now? They're playing dumb. And when they're not playing dumb, they're playing scared. The MSNBC studio had gone silent. And in that silence, Jasmine added one final blow. They stripped food from hungry kids. They gutted healthcare. And now they're shielding a predator because they think nobody's watching. But I am watching. And so is America. The screen split momentarily between her and Hayes, and even he looked like he knew. This wasn't a typical interview. This was an unflinching exposure. The silence after Jasmine's final line wasn't just dead air, it was weight. Heavy, undeniable weight. Chris Hayes finally leaned back in his chair, letting out a breath like he'd just witnessed something seismic. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said carefully, "those are strong words." "They're overdue words," Jasmine replied. "We've spent years dancing around the truth." Meanwhile, the same people who scream about border security, about crime, about law and order, they're the ones backing a man connected to an international child sex trafficker. And when the receipts start showing up, they bury them under process and procedure. Chris looked into the camera, unsure how to follow that up. But Jasmine wasn't done. "You know what's crazy?" she continued. "The GOP called me unfit. They called me extreme. But they're the ones who sat silent when a judge found their party leader liable for assault. They didn't demand accountability, they handed him a microphone. The audience on the other side of the screen wasn't just listening, they were staring. Jasmine had taken the entire narrative and flipped it upside down. And let me say this, directly, she added, to every Republican watching, you had a chance to lead. To choose truth. To protect children. But you chose silence. And silence in the face of abuse? That makes you complicit." Chris Hayes leaned forward again, but this time not as a journalist. This time, as someone watching history break open, live. The moment Jasmine finished speaking, the control room lit up. Producers scrambled, messages flooded in, and clips of the interview were already circulating online before the show had even ended. Chris Hayes turned toward the camera. "What you just witnessed wasn't a soundbite. It was a reckoning." Jasmine sat calmly, but there was steel in her eyes. She had just pulled back the curtain, not just on Trump, not just on the GOP's hypocrisy, but on an entire ecosystem of silence and protection. And America was listening. The hashtag Crockett exposes everything trended within minutes. On social media, users shared her quotes with captions like, "She said what no one else would," and "This is how you use a microphone." At GOP headquarters, aides were scrambling. Conservative hosts either avoided the clip entirely or attempted to downplay it, but it was too late. The footage was everywhere. The truth was out. And Jasmine? She didn't wait for applause. She stood up, straightened her jacket, and walked out of the studio like she'd done exactly what she came to do. Outside, a crowd had gathered, young people, activists, even disillusioned voters. One woman yelled, "Thank you for not letting them get away with it." Jasmine nodded. "This wasn't just about Epstein," she said to a nearby camera phone. "It's about who they protect, and who they betray. And I'm not done." She turned, disappeared into the night, and left the country buzzing. Tonight wasn't just a broadcast. It was a wake-up call. While others stay silent, while others protect predators and twist justice into knots, Jasmine Crockett spoke with fearless clarity. She named names. She asked the questions too many are too afraid to ask. And she made one thing unmistakably clear. The silence surrounding Epstein isn't an oversight, it's a strategy. A shield. A cover-up. But that shield cracked tonight. Jasmine didn't just speak. She shattered the script. She reminded America that justice doesn't serve the powerful, it holds them accountable. So to every viewer watching, don't forget what you heard. Don't let them spin it. Don't let them bury it. Because if we stay loud, if we stay focused, they can't hide forever. This isn't over. This is only the beginning.